Let me ask you, if you were teaching let's just say, what could be undergraduate or graduate seminar in investing now? So you were teaching a class of neophytes how to invest, and some are, say, mathematically inclined and some are not. It's a very mixed group. What types of tools or thinking frameworks, heuristics, mental models, anything would you focus on in the first handful of lectures?
The first thing I would tell them is the answer is really easy for almost everybody, but you're not going to believe me until you work it through yourself and understand it. And I'll tell you the answer to start with, and then I'll try to convince you that it's the right answer. So I'll just tell you the answer to start with. The answer is, if you're a long-term investor, you should just buy and hold equities. And the best place to have bought and hold equities has been the U.S. for the last couple of hundred years overall. Equities here have compounded at about 10 or 10.5% for 200 years. The data for the first 100 years is not as good as the data for the last 100, but the data for the last 100 is quite good and very well documented. How does that do against everybody else? Well, you can prove by logical and mathematical arguments, and I won't go into all the details here. Some of it's in my book. It's also in other places. You can prove that if a person simply buys the index and holds it, he will outperform most of all the other players. And he will simply, the people who buy and hold the index will beat the whole collection of people who don't do that. They do way better on average. The ones who don't do that pay trading costs. They have more volatility from diversification generally, from lack of diversification. And they often pay investment advisors and all this, and they also pay taxes when they trade. So the upshot is that you might make 10.5% if you don't pay all these people. You might make 8 or 7 or 6% if you pay the crowd of people waiting to, quote, help you, unquote. So that's the simple answer for people who don't know anything about investing. Now you might say, well, yeah, but I'm pretty smart. I hear all these stories. I listen to Kramer on TV. He jumps around and makes a lot of noise and sounds good. So why can't I do better? Well, the academics have something called the efficient market theory, in which they claim that you can't do better. Now, I've already explained that that's wrong. You can find instances where you can do better. Warren Buffett currently did much better. I found with my hedge fund I could do much better. But the kind of work you have to put in to do much better is substantial. It doesn't seem like it at first, but when you get into it, there are all kinds of details and follow-ups and things to be checked out. And you end up spending a substantial amount of time and energy figuring out how to do it better. And for everybody who finds out how to do it better, the rest of the crowd who isn't buying the index is doing a little bit worse, because you can show that the whole collection of people who don't buy the index are themselves as a group like the index. Because everybody as a group is like the index, you subtract the index part out and the rest is like the index too. And so the people who aren't buying the index but are like the index as a group are busy paying all these costs, taxes, investment advisors, and so forth. So on average, that whole group does worse. So you're paying basically casino vigorish or whatever if you're not indexing. And you've got to beat that in order to do better than the indexers. And obviously, the group can't beat that. So it's only a small collection of people, some by luck and some by skill, who end up doing better. So you're basically betting against the odds if you just step in and buy stories and invest in various mutual funds that are actively managed and so forth. So that's what I would tell people. Now, Now, on the other side of the coin, if you really are interested in investing, it's worth educating yourself and trying to do it because you will learn a lot about investing. You might actually find a way to win, and you'll learn about how the world works and a lot about life, too. The things you learn from what seems like a narrow, specialized field generalize very widely to all kinds of things if you're the kind of person who can take a lesson in one part of life and transport it to another part of life.
What are some of those transferable lessons in your mind? Some of those transferable lessons in your mind?
Well, let's take risk as a good example. You learn about investment risk and how you want to avoid very great risks or minimize them. If you take that, because great investment risks can take you out of the game altogether. So you might have a thing where you multiply your money by 10 times, but you might also lose it all. Some things that are highly volatile, like buying cryptocurrency, are in this category where you may have the chance of a very large gain, but also the chance of a very large loss. And if you lose most of your capital, it's very hard to climb back out. For instance, if you lose 90% of your capital, you've got to multiply what's left by 10 in order to get back to even, which means you've got to make 900% to offset that 90% loss. That's not going to be easy to do. It takes a long time. So you want to avoid really bad outcomes. So I applied that, for example, to COVID.
Recommendations for, and this might sound a little meta, but how people should think about long-term thinking or the long term, because the recommendation for, say, an equity index or index ETFs was predicated on investing and holding for a long period of time. What would you consider sort of the minimal viable long period of time? If you have an answer to that, and how can people become more aware of their own weaknesses related to short-termism or short-term thinking and switch to more long-term?
I tend to be a long-term thinker. You might say, well, if you're 89, how can you be a long-term thinker? Well, I have children and grandchildren, and I also am feeling pretty good and staying in good shape, so 89 may not be all that old at this point. In any case, I would say that if you're looking at 15 or 20 years or more, maybe you have a dynasty trust or something like that, or you have descendants, and you yourself expect to live 15 or 20 years or more, the best investment, I think, is to buy almost entirely equities and hold it. You might want to have a little cash around, but I think Buffett recommends 90% index and 10% bonds or short-term, intermediate-term bonds for cash. That does just about as well as 100% equities. I just put it all in equities because I have enough so I don't have to worry about fluctuations up and down. If you have a shorter time horizon, you may want to do things differently. And it depends on how much you're going to need and how much you have. I have a set of rules that are a little bit helpful here. I'll start with what I'll call the 4% rule. Suppose that you're going to retire and you want enough to last you from your capital throughout the rest of your life. I would say a pretty good working rule is to put it mostly in equities and spend 4% of your capital each year or less if you can. And that ought to last you from, say, the 60s till the end of your life. It's not guaranteed, but pretty good chance it will. Then I have the 2% rule, which I've found by studies, both mathematical and by simulation of stock returns. If you only drain 2% out per year, then that money will probably grow in perpetuity. There's a small chance it'll be extinguished by really bad downturns, but it's very small. There is an organization that freezes people, and they asked me for advice about how to invest their endowment fund.
Freezing meaning cryogenically freezing people?
Yes. And so I said, for the endowment fund, which is going to get people out of being frozen sometime in the far future, 50, 100, 200 years out, for that fund, you're going to want to invest long-term and let it run, because that's going to get you the most money down the road. And if you're going to attempt to reanimate somebody, there's no specific timetable.